Don't forget to like the video, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to stay updated with our latest stories. It all started on a Tuesday, I remember, because Richard always played golf on Tuesdays, rain or shine, and he came home that afternoon with a troubled look that had nothing to do with a missed putt. He dropped his keys in the ceramic bowl by the door, the one I bought on our trip to Santa Fe, and sighed. That sigh was a prelude, a little drum roll before the announcement I knew was coming. I was in the kitchen, kneading dough for a loaf of sourdough, a hobby I'd picked up that was more about keeping my hands busy than the actual bread. Linda, he started, and I paused, my hands sticky and white. Got a bit of a situation. Richard is a man of few words when it comes to problems, especially other people's. He's a good man. My Richard, steady as a rock, but he tends to carry the world on his shoulders without wanting to burden me. Most of the time, I appreciate it. Sometimes, though, a little warning would be nice. What kind of situation? I asked, wiping my hands on my apron. The late afternoon sun was streaming through the kitchen window, lighting up the dust motes dancing in the air. Our kitchen is usually a warm, happy place, smelling of yeast or spices. But just then, a little chill seemed to creep in. "It's Michael," he said, running a hand through his already thinning hair. "Michael Thompson. You remember him? From college? We reconnected at that alumni thing last year." I did remember, vaguely. Tall, quiet fellow, Richard had said he was going through a rough patch back then. What about him? "Well, he's in a real bind, Lynn. Lost his job a few months back, his apartment lease is up, and the place he was supposed to move into fell through. He's got nowhere to go for a bit." I stopped kneading. I could see where this was heading. Our house wasn't huge, but it wasn't small either, especially now that our two kids, Jenny and Tom, were grown and flown. We had a guest room, mostly used for storing out-of-season clothes and Jenny's old art projects. And he needs a place to stay. I finished for him, trying to keep my voice neutral. It wasn't that I was inherently against helping someone. It was more the suddenness of it, the disruption to our quiet, predictable life. We were comfortable, Richard and I, in our little routines. Morning coffee together, him off to his part-time consultancy work or golf, me with my gardening, my book club, my sourdough. Evenings were usually dinner, a bit of television, and early to bed. A house guest, a practical stranger, felt like a stone tossed into a calm pond. Richard looked relieved that I'd jumped to the conclusion. "Just for a little while," he said. "A few weeks, maybe a month at most. Just until he gets back on his feet. He's a good guy, Linda. Really, just down on his luck." I thought of the guest room, filled with boxes and memories. I thought of shared bathrooms and polite breakfast conversation with a man I barely knew. When would this be? "He's, kind of in his car right now, parked down the street." My eyebrows shot up. "Richard, you didn't even discuss it with me first." He had the decency to look sheepish. It all happened fast. He called me from a coffee shop, sounding pretty desperate. I couldn't just say no, could I? I told him I needed to check with you, of course. He added hastily, "But I knew you'd understand. You've got such a good heart." Flattery. It wasn't going to work. Not entirely. But then I imagined this Michael, a man our age, sitting alone in his car with his life, probably packed into a few suitcases, and a little of my resistance softened. We'd been fortunate. Richard had a good pension. I had my small online craft business. And our home was our sanctuary. What if it were us? "All right, Richard," I sighed, untying my apron. "Go tell him he can come in. But a few weeks, you promise? And he needs to be actively looking for another place." Of course, absolutely, Richard said, his face breaking into a relieved smile. He kissed my cheek, a quick peck. Thank you, Lynn. You're the best. As he headed out the front door, I went to the guest room. It was a bit of a mess, smelling faintly of lavender sachets and old books. I opened the window to let in some fresh air and started clearing a space on the bed, pushing aside a box of Jenny's college textbooks. The room faced the backyard, overlooking my rose bushes, which were just starting to bloom. It was a peaceful view. Maybe it wouldn't be so bad. A few minutes later, I heard the front door open again, and the murmur of voices. Richard's familiar baritone, and another, softer voice I didn't recognize. I took a deep breath, smoothed down my t-shirt, and went out to meet our temporary house guest. Michael Thompson was standing in our hallway, looking a little lost. He was about Richard's height, maybe a bit slimmer, with kind eyes that seemed to hold a whole lot of worry. His hair was mostly gray, neatly cut, and he was wearing a clean but slightly rumpled shirt. He held a worn duffel bag in one hand and a laptop case in the other. There was a quiet dignity about him, despite his circumstances. He wasn't what I call classically handsome, but there was a gentleness in his face, a sort of thoughtful, almost sad intelligence that was immediately apparent. Linda, this is Michael, Richard said, perhaps a little too heartily. Michael, my wife, Linda. Michael offered a small, tentative smile. Linda, it's so incredibly kind of you to let me stay. I I can't tell you how much I appreciate it. I promise I won't be a burden. His voice was softer than I expected, a little gravelly, like he hadn't used it much that day. It's no trouble at all, Michael, I said, trying to sound more welcoming than I initially felt. We have the space. Come on, let me show you to the room. As I led him down the short hallway, I could feel his gaze taking in our home, the photos of the kids on the wall, the slightly cluttered bookshelf, the comfortable, lived-in feel of the place. It made me suddenly aware of how much of our life was on display, how intimate it was to bring a stranger into the heart of it. The guest room, now slightly more presentable, seemed to meet his approval. This is wonderful, he said, his voice thick with emotion. Thank you. Really? He placed his bags down by the small desk near the window. The view of the garden is lovely. I enjoy my roses, I said, finding myself smiling a little. Richard tells me you're between places right now. He nodded, looking out the window for a moment before turning back to me. Yes, it's been a bit of a challenging time, but I'm working on it. I've got a few leads on jobs, and I'm searching for apartments daily. There was a flicker of something in his eyes, pain, maybe, or just exhaustion. It tugged at something in me. This wasn't just an inconvenience. This was a man trying to hold himself together. Well, I said, trying to sound practical and warm. Make yourself comfortable. The bathroom is just next door. We usually have dinner around 7, if that works for you. Nothing fancy tonight, just some homemade soup, and that sourdough I was wrestling with earlier. That sounds perfect, Linda. Thank you. He looked genuinely grateful, and for the first time, I felt a small, unbidden warmth toward him. Maybe Richard was right. Maybe this wouldn't be so bad after all. Maybe it was the right thing to do. That first evening, dinner was a little awkward, as expected. Richard did most of the talking, reminiscing about college pranks and old professors, trying to bridge the gap of years. Michael listened politely, contributed a few anecdotes, but mostly seemed tired. He ate everything I put in front of him, praising the soup and the bread, which, I had to admit, had turned out pretty well. He excused himself fairly early, saying he needed to make some calls and organize his job search. I found myself watching him walk down the hall to the guest room, a quiet, solitary figure. There was a story there, a depth of experience I couldn't quite fathom yet, and a surprising part of me was curious. Later, as Richard and I were getting ready for bed, he squeezed my hand. Thanks again, Lynn. It means a lot to him. He seems like a decent man, I admitted, pulling back the covers. Quiet. He's always been a bit reserved, Richard said, yawning, but solid. You'll see. I lay in the dark for a while after Richard had fallen asleep, his gentle snores a familiar rhythm in the quiet house. I thought about Michael, alone in the guest room, just a few doors down. I thought about the subtle shift in the atmosphere of our home, the introduction of an unknown element. It wasn't necessarily unpleasant, just different. There was a faint tension, yes, but it was mingled with a sense of anticipation, a feeling that things were, perhaps, about to become a little less predictable. And a tiny, unexplored part of me wondered if that might not be such a bad thing. I hadn't realized, until that moment, just how predictable my days had become. The first few days with Michael in the house settled into a tentative rhythm. He was an exceptionally considerate guest, almost to a fault. He was up early, usually before me, and the quiet hum of his laptop would drift from the guest room as he scoured job sites. He insisted on making his own simple breakfast, usually just toast and coffee, and was meticulous about cleaning up after himself, leaving the kitchen spotless. Richard would head off to his various activities, and Michael would often retreat to the guest room or take long walks, his phone pressed to his ear, presumably for interviews or networking calls. I'd go about my own routines, gardening, errands, working on my small online business selling handcrafted cards. We'd exchange polite greetings, brief conversations about the weather or the news. He always asked if I needed help with anything, offering to carry groceries or assist in the garden, but I usually declined, not wanting to impose. He joined us for dinner each evening, and those meals became the main point of interaction. Richard would try to draw him out, and slowly, Michael began to share a little more about himself, though he remained guarded about the specifics of his job loss and the breakup of his most recent relationship, which Richard had briefly mentioned to me had happened a few months prior. He spoke more easily about his interests. He was an avid reader, particularly of history and biographies, and he had a surprising knowledge of classic films, a passion I shared. One evening, about a week into his stay, Richard was late. He'd called to say his golf game had run long, and then he and his buddies had decided to grab a bite at the clubhouse. You two go ahead and eat, he'd said. Don't wait for me. So, it was just Michael and me at the dinner table. I'd made a chicken pot pie, a comfort food I often turned to when the evenings grew a little cooler. The silence felt a bit more pronounced without Richard's easygoing chatter to fill it. This is delicious, Linda, Michael said after a few bites. You're a wonderful cook. Thank you, Michael, I replied. It's an old family recipe. An awkward pause. I searched for a topic. So, any luck on the job front today? He sighed, a small, almost imperceptible sound, and put his fork down. A few nibbles, but nothing concrete yet. It's tougher out there than I anticipated. Or maybe I'm just a bit rusty at this whole process. He gave a wry, self-deprecating smile. I'm sure something will come through soon, I said, trying to sound encouraging. You seem very capable. He looked at me, then a directness in his gaze that was new. That's kind of you to say. Most days I don't feel it. There was a vulnerability in his admission that caught me off guard. Up until then, he'd maintained a very stoic, almost formal demeanor. This was the first real crack I'd seen in that facade. It's understandable, I said softly. Going through so many changes at once must be incredibly stressful. He nodded, looking down at his plate. It is. Some days it feels like I'm treading water in a very big ocean. He paused, then looked up again, a hint of apology in his eyes. I'm sorry. I don't mean to be a downer. Not at all, Michael, I said, and I meant it. It's all right to feel that way. And it's all right to talk about it. That's what friends are for, isn't it? Or, in this case, your friend's wife who makes a decent pot pie. He chuckled, a genuine, warm sound that crinkled the corners of his eyes. It was the first time I'd heard him laugh like that. It transformed his face, making him look younger, less burdened. Thank you, Linda. I appreciate that. More than you know. We ate in a more comfortable silence for a few minutes. Then, I decided to venture a little further. Richard mentioned you enjoy classic movies. I'm a bit of a fan myself. Any particular favorites? His face lit up. Oh, absolutely. Casablanca? Of course. The Philadelphia Story. Hitchcock, naturally, Rear Window is a masterpiece of suspense. Oh, I love Rear Window. I exclaimed. Grace Kelly was never more beautiful, and the tension is just incredible, all in that one apartment set. And just like that, we were off. We talked about old films for the rest of the meal, discovering a shared love for the witty dialogue of screwball comedies, the stark shadows of film noir, the sweeping epics of David Lean. It turned out Michael had an encyclopedic knowledge of actors, directors, even cinematographers. I found myself completely engrossed, forgetting the awkwardness, forgetting he was practically a stranger. It was like talking to an old friend, someone who understood a passion I rarely got to share in such depth. Richard enjoyed movies, but he didn't dissect them the way Michael and I found ourselves doing. When Richard finally came home around 9, he found us in the living room, not watching television, but still animatedly discussing the merits of black and white cinematography versus Technicolor. Well, look at you two, Richard said, smiling, clearly pleased, solving the world's problems, or just dissecting old movies. Both, I think, Michael said, grinning. He looked more relaxed than I'd seen him since he arrived. Linda's a tough critic. Richard winked at Michael. If she's agreeing with you on movies, you must be doing something right. I playfully swatted Richard's arm. It's just nice to talk to someone who appreciates the classics. That night, as I lay in bed, I thought about the evening. It had been unexpectedly pleasant. The conversation had flowed so easily, so naturally. Michael was intelligent, articulate, and when he spoke about something he was passionate about, his earlier reserve melted away. I realized I hadn't had a conversation like that, one that sparked with shared enthusiasm for a specific interest, in a very long time. It wasn't a failing on Richard's part. We had our own ways of connecting, our comfortable companionship built over decades. But this was different. It was the thrill of discovering a kindred spirit in an unexpected place. A few evenings later, after another quiet dinner, Richard was engrossed in a baseball game on television. The volume was a bit too loud for my liking, and I saw Michael subtly wince. I wasn't particularly interested in the game myself. Michael, I said on impulse, I have a collection of old vinyl records in the study, lots of jazz, some classic crooners. Would you be interested in listening to some? It's quieter in there. His eyes brightened. I'd love that, Linda, very much. We excused ourselves, leaving Richard to his game. The study was my little sanctuary, lined with books, a comfortable armchair, and my old turntable. I pulled out a few favorites: Ella Fitzgerald, Frank Sinatra, Miles Davis. Michael browsed the spines with an appreciative expression. You have excellent taste, he commented, picking up a Duke Ellington album. This is fantastic. I put it on the turntable, and soon the rich, warm notes of Ellington's orchestra filled the small room. We didn't talk much at first, just listened, letting the music create its own atmosphere. It was a comfortable silence, not an awkward one. I found myself watching Michael. He sat in the armchair, his eyes closed, a faint smile on his lips, completely absorbed in the music. There was a certain grace in his stillness, a sense of a man who, despite his current troubles, could find beauty and solace in art. After a while, between tracks, he began to speak, not about his problems, but about music, about memories the songs evoked from his younger years, about concerts he'd attended. I shared some of my own memories, the songs that had been the soundtrack to different moments in my life. We talked about how music can transport you, how it can hold so much emotion in just a few notes. It was late when we finally realized the time. Richard had long since gone to bed. The house was silent except for the soft hiss of the needle at the end of the record. Thank you, Linda, Michael said, his voice soft in the quiet room. This was a real treat. I haven't just listened to music like this, really listened, in years. Me neither, I confessed. It was lovely. As he stood up to leave, he paused at the door. You know, Linda, he said, turning back to me, his expression earnest. You and Richard, you've been incredibly kind to me. But you, especially, you've made me feel welcome, human, at a time when I was feeling quite lost. I just wanted you to know that. His words touched me deeply. I hadn't consciously set out to do anything special, just tried to be a decent host. But hearing him say that, seeing the sincerity in his eyes, made me realize that perhaps these small moments of connection, these shared conversations and quiet evenings meant more than I knew. I'm glad, Michael, I said, my voice a little husky. I'm glad we could help, even in small ways. He nodded, gave me a small, grateful smile, and then quietly headed to his room. I stood in the study for a few moments longer, the scent of old vinyl and the lingering notes of jazz seeming to hang in the air. A profound sense of warmth spread through me. It wasn't romantic, not in the slightest. It was something else, something gentler, and perhaps even rarer. It was the quiet joy of an unexpected friendship, a connection forged in shared moments of honesty and understanding. I felt a shift within myself, a subtle awakening. My predictable life had indeed been stirred, but the ripples were proving to be surprisingly beautiful. I found myself looking forward to our quiet talks, to discovering more about this thoughtful, gentle man who had, by a twist of fate, ended up in our home. The weeks passed, and Michael's presence in our home became a familiar comfort rather than an intrusion. He was still diligent with his job search, spending hours on his laptop in the guest room or taking calls in the garden, his voice a low murmur against the backdrop of buzzing bees and rustling leaves. There were rejections, of course, and moments of discouragement I could sense even if he didn't voice them directly. But he never complained, never let his anxieties cast a pall over the household. Our evening conversations deepened. Sometimes Richard would be there, contributing his own thoughts, but often he'd be tired from his day or engrossed in a project in his workshop, leaving Michael and me to our discussions. We talked about everything and nothing, books we were reading, articles that had caught our eye, memories from our pasts. He told me about his childhood in a small Midwestern town, his early aspirations to be a writer, the twists and turns his career had taken before he'd found himself in corporate communications, a field he'd been successful in, but which, I sensed, had never truly fed his soul. I, in turn, found myself sharing things I hadn't spoken about in years. My own youthful dreams of being a painter, a passion I'd largely set aside when motherhood and the practicalities of life took precedence. I told him about the challenges and joys of raising Jenny and Tom, the quiet ache of the empty nest, the way I sometimes felt like I was still figuring out who I was, even in my 50s. Michael was an incredible listener. He wouldn't just nod along, he'd ask thoughtful questions, offer insights that made me see things in a new light. He had a way of making you feel heard, truly heard, in a way that was both rare and incredibly validating. There was no judgment in his eyes, only a quiet empathy that created a safe space for honesty. One Saturday afternoon, Richard was off on an all-day fishing trip with some old buddies. The weather was glorious, one of those perfect late spring days where the sun is warm, but a gentle breeze keeps things from getting too hot. I was planning to spend the day in the garden, tackling a particularly overgrown patch of weeds. Michael emerged from his room around mid-morning, looking a little weary. "Another round of online applications done," he said with a sigh, pouring himself a cup of coffee. "Any promising leads?" I asked, tying on my gardening hat. "A couple of possibilities. Waiting to hear back." He looked out the kitchen window at the sunny backyard. "It's a beautiful day." "It is," I agreed. "I'm heading out to do some serious weeding. That back corner by the fence is threatening to declare independence." He smiled. "Need a hand? I'm surprisingly good at pulling weeds. Grew up on a farm, remember?" I hesitated for a moment. I usually guarded my gardening time. It was my therapy, my solitary communion with the earth. But then I thought, why not? "Are you sure? I wouldn't want to take you away from your job search." "A break would do me good," he said. "And frankly, a bit of physical labor sounds appealing right now. Better than staring at a screen. Anyway, so we spent the next few hours in the garden together. I gave him a pair of gloves and showed him the difference between the persistent dandelions and the violets I actually wanted to keep. He was, as promised, a surprisingly efficient weeder, and he didn't seem to mind the dirt or the exertion. We worked in comfortable companionship, sometimes chatting, sometimes in silence, the only sounds the scrape of trowels, the chirping of birds, and the occasional contented sigh from me as a particularly stubborn weed finally surrendered its grip. The sun warmed our backs, and the scent of damp earth and crushed greenery filled the air. At one point, as we were clearing out a tangle of old ivy from the base of the oak tree, he said, "This is nice, Linda, really nice. It reminds me of helping my mom in her garden when I was a kid. She had the most amazing roses, much like yours. Gardening connects us to something real, doesn't it?" I mused, sitting back on my heels for a moment to wipe a bead of sweat from my brow. In a world that feels increasingly virtual, there's something so grounding about having your hands in the soil. He nodded, his expression thoughtful. "It's honest work. You plant a seed, you nurture it, it grows. There's a straightforwardness to it that I find reassuring, especially now." We talked then, more deeply than we had before, about the search for meaning and purpose, especially as one gets older. He spoke of the sense of dislocation he felt after losing his job, how much of his identity had been tied up in his career. I confessed my own occasional feelings of restlessness, the sense that there was still something more I wanted to do, to experience, to become. "It's funny, isn't it?" I said, looking out over the now much tidier garden bed. "You spend your life building things, a career, a family, and then you reach a point where you start to wonder what it all adds up to and what comes next." Michael was quiet for a moment, pulling at a stubborn root. "I think," he said slowly, "the what comes next is about finding new ways to grow. Not necessarily in terms of career or grand achievements, but internally finding new joys, new connections. Like this." He gestured vaguely between us. At the garden, the shared work. This morning, helping you here, talking like this, it's a good feeling. A real feeling. His words resonated deeply with me. It was a real feeling. This unexpected friendship, the honest conversations, the quiet companionship. It was nurturing a part of me I hadn't realized was thirsty. Later, when we were cleaning up, our hands earthy and our muscles pleasantly tired, I found an old bird's nest tucked into a low-hanging branch of the lilac bush, perfectly formed but empty. Look at this, I said, showing it to Michael. So intricate, someone put a lot of work into this home. He examined it gently, and then they moved on. But the structure is still there, still beautiful in its own way. It felt like a metaphor for so many things, for lives, for relationships, for the homes we make and sometimes have to leave. That afternoon, sitting on the porch with tall glasses of iced tea, watching the shadows lengthen across the lawn, I felt a profound sense of peace and a surprising sense of joy. The connection I'd forged with Michael wasn't something I had ever anticipated. It was a quiet, unassuming thing built on shared moments and honest words, but it was having a significant impact on me. It was making me look at my own life with fresh eyes, prompting me to consider my own needs for connection and intellectual stimulation, needs I hadn't perhaps fully acknowledged before. It wasn't about Richard or any lack in our marriage. Richard was my bedrock, my history, my comfortable love. This connection with Michael was different. It was like discovering a new room in a familiar house, a room filled with interesting books and fascinating conversations, a room that added a new dimension to the whole structure. The emotional climax of this unexpected chapter in my life didn't arrive with a dramatic flourish, but rather with the quiet intensity of a dawning realization. It happened about a month into Michael's stay. He had a promising second interview lined up for a position that sounded like a good fit, and there was a new lightness in his step, a hopeful energy that had been missing before. One evening, Richard was at his weekly poker game, a ritual that usually kept him out late. Michael and I had finished dinner, a simple pasta dish we'd prepared together, laughing over a minor mishap with an overflowing pot of boiling water. The ease between us was so natural now, it was hard to remember those first slightly awkward days. After we cleaned up the kitchen, Michael said, "Linda, there's an independent movie playing at the Avalon tonight, one I think you'd really like. It's by that Swedish director we were talking about last week. Would you be interested in going?" My treat, of course. The Avalon was our local art house cinema, a place I loved but rarely visited because Richard wasn't much for foreign films or anything too artsy. As he put it, "I'd love to, Michael," I said, genuinely pleased by the invitation. "Let me just grab my purse." The movie was as thought-provoking and beautifully filmed as Michael had suggested. It was a quiet drama, exploring themes of loss, memory, and the unexpected connections that can reshape a life. Afterwards, instead of heading straight home, we walked to a nearby cafe that stayed open late, the kind with mismatched chairs and local art on the walls. We ordered coffee and a shared slice of tiramisu. And for a long while, we just talked about the film, dissecting its layers of meaning, the performances, the cinematography. It was the kind of deep, immersive conversation about art and ideas that I craved, the kind that left me feeling energized and mentally alive. Then, somehow, the conversation shifted. Michael started talking, really talking, about the collapse of his last relationship, something he'd only alluded to before. He didn't go into salacious details, but he spoke of the quiet erosion of understanding, the growing distance, the painful realization that they wanted different things from life. He spoke of the loneliness he'd felt even before it ended, and the fear of starting over, not just in his career, but in his personal life too. He wasn't looking for pity, I knew. He was simply sharing his truth, his vulnerability, in this quiet, lamplit cafe with someone he'd come to trust. I listened, really listened, my heart aching with empathy for the pain he'd clearly endured. When he finished, there was a moment of silence, the clatter of cups from the counter, the only sound. Then I found myself saying, "Thank you for sharing that with me, Michael. I know it couldn't have been easy." He looked at me, his gaze direct and filled with a raw honesty. "I haven't talked about it like that with anyone, Linda. Not really. But I felt you would understand." And in that moment, something profound settled between us. It wasn't a romantic spark, not at all. It was something deeper, a recognition of shared humanity, of the universal experiences of pain, loss, and the quiet search for connection. It was the realization that this man, who had come into my life as a stranger in need, had become a true friend, someone with whom I could share not just a love of old movies or jazz, but the deeper currents of our inner lives. "I do understand," I said softly, "more than you might think." And then, emboldened by his openness, I found myself talking about some of my own unspoken feelings, about the times I'd felt a little adrift since the kids left home, the way my own identity seemed to be in a quiet state of flux. I spoke of the comfort of my marriage to Richard, but also of a certain unacknowledged loneliness, a yearning for a different kind of intellectual and emotional companionship that I hadn't even been able to name until recently. It was as if a dam had broken within me, and words I hadn't realized I was holding back began to flow. Michael listened with the same quiet intensity and empathy he always showed. He didn't offer solutions or platitudes, just the profound gift of his presence and his understanding. "It sounds like you're on a journey of rediscover yourself, Linda," he said gently when I finally paused. "Maybe I am," I admitted, a little surprised to hear the words spoken aloud. "And maybe," I added, looking at him with a gratitude that felt immense, "you've been an unexpected guide on that journey." A slow smile spread across his face. "Well, maybe we've been guides for each other, then, because your kindness, your friendship, it's been a lifeline for me these past few weeks. You helped me see that even when things fall apart, there are still good people, good moments, and reasons to keep going." The waitress came to clear our cups, a brief interruption to the intensity of the moment. When she left, I looked at Michael, and I knew that this was it, the what happened that the clickbait title of my story might allude to. It wasn't a scandalous affair or a dramatic revelation. It was something much quieter, much more profound, and infinitely more precious. It was the discovery of a deep, resonant, and entirely platonic emotional intimacy with another human being, an intimacy that had crept up on me unexpectedly and enriched my life in ways I could never have imagined. It was the realization that true connection can come in many forms, and that sometimes the most significant relationships are the ones that don't fit neatly into predefined boxes. Michael's friendship had opened up a part of me that had been dormant. He saw me, Linda, not just as Richard's wife or Jenny and Tom's mother, but as an individual with her own thoughts, dreams, and inner world. And in feeling seen, I began to see myself more clearly. We walked home slowly through the cool night air, the streets quiet and empty. We didn't talk much on the way back. There was no need. A comfortable understanding flowed between us. When we reached my front door, Michael turned to me. "Thank you, Linda," he said, his voice soft. "For the movie, for the coffee, for everything." "Thank you, Michael," I replied, meeting his gaze, "for being such a good friend." There was a moment, just a fleeting second, where I think we both felt the depth of the bond that had formed between us. It was a precious, fragile thing born of shared vulnerability and mutual respect. As I got ready for bed that night, Richard was already asleep, his breathing soft, and even beside me. I lay there thinking about the evening, about Michael, about the unexpected turn my life had taken. I felt a sense of fullness, of emotional richness that had been missing for a long time. It wasn't that my life before had been empty, but this new connection had added vibrant new colors to my personal palette. I felt more alive, more attuned to my own feelings, more aware of the world around me. The unexpected guest had brought an unexpected gift, the gift of a profound human connection, and through it, a deeper connection to myself. And I knew with a quiet certainty that I would never be quite the same. I had grown. A few days after our evening at the Avalon, Michael got the call. He'd gotten the job. The relief and joy on his face were palpable. He came into the kitchen where I was arranging flowers, a wide smile transforming his usually more reserved features. "I got it, Linda. I got the job," he exclaimed, his voice brimming with excitement. Richard was there too, just back from an errand, and he clapped Michael on the back. A hearty congratulation. "That's wonderful news, Michael," I said, my heart swelling with happiness for him. "We knew you would. When you start?" "In 2 weeks," he said. "It's downtown, a good company, interesting work." And he added, almost unable to contain his grin, "I found a small apartment too, not far from the office. I can move in next weekend." A pang, surprisingly sharp, went through me. Of course, this was the goal, what we'd all been hoping for. But the thought of Michael leaving, of our quiet evenings and easy conversations coming to an end, left a sudden ache. Our house would feel different, quieter, without his gentle presence. The following week was a flurry of activity for Michael as he made arrangements for his new apartment and prepared for his new job. He was energized, focused, and a sense of his old confidence seemed to be returning. He still joined us for dinner, but the conversations were now more about his future plans, his hopes for this new chapter. The day before he was due to move out, he found me in the garden, tending to my roses. He'd often sought me out there, knowing it was my quiet place. "Linda," he began a little hesitantly, I I can't thank you and Richard enough for everything. You took me in when I was at my lowest, and you gave me not just a roof over my head, but, well, you gave me back a sense of hope." I snipped a particularly beautiful blush pink rose and handed it to him. "We were happy to help, Michael, and you've been a wonderful guest. More than a guest, really, a friend." He took the rose, inhaling its fragrance. "That means a lot to me, Linda. Your friendship, it's been invaluable. You listened when I needed to talk. You shared your home and your life with such generosity. You helped me remember who I was and who I could be again." There was a comfortable silence for a moment, the bees humming around us, the sun warm on our faces. "I'm going to miss our talks," I said, voicing the thought that had been lingering in my mind all week. "The house will seem very quiet." "I'll miss them too," he said, his voice a little thick. "But this isn't goodbye, is it? Just a change of address. We'll stay in touch. I'd like that very much." "I'd like that too, Michael," I said, and I meant it with all my heart. The next morning, Richard helped Michael load his few belongings into his car. It didn't take long. As he stood by the car, ready to leave, he shook Richard's hand warmly. "Thank you, my friend, for everything." "Anytime, Michael," Richard said, with genuine affection. "Glad we could be here for you. Don't be a stranger. You hear?" Then Michael turned to me. There were no grand pronouncements, no dramatic farewells. He simply looked at me, his kind eyes conveying a wealth of unspoken emotion. He stepped forward and, rather unexpectedly, gave me a brief, gentle hug. It was a hug of friendship, of gratitude, of shared understanding. "Thank you, Linda," he murmured, "for everything. Take care, Michael," I said, my voice a little unsteady. "And be happy." He nodded, got into his car, and with a final wave, he drove away. I watched until the car disappeared around the corner. Then Richard put his arm around my shoulders. "He's a good man," Richard said quietly. "He'll be all right." "Yes," I said, leaning into Richard's familiar embrace. "He will." In the days and weeks that followed, the house did feel quieter. I missed Michael's presence, the easy companionship, the stimulating conversations. But it wasn't an empty quiet. It was a thoughtful quiet, a space for reflection. His stay had been relatively short, just under 2 months, but the impact was lasting. My unexpected friendship with Michael had been a catalyst for my own personal discovery. It had reminded me of the importance of intellectual curiosity, of emotional honesty, of seeking out connections that nourish the mind and spirit. I found myself reading more, exploring new music, even tentatively sketching again in an old notebook I found tucked away in a drawer. I started reaching out more to my own friends, engaging in deeper conversations. My relationship with Richard, too, felt subtly enriched. It wasn't that anything had been terribly wrong before, but I felt more present, more engaged in my own life, and that vitality naturally spilled over into my marriage. Richard noticed, commenting that I seemed happier, more energetic. We started taking more walks together, trying new restaurants, even attempting a foreign film or two at the Avalon, much to my surprise and delight. Michael and I did stay in touch. We'd email occasionally, share articles or book recommendations. A few months later, we met for coffee, and it was like picking up with an old, dear friend. He was thriving in his new job. His apartment felt like home, and there was a new spark of optimism in his eyes. Looking back, the period when Richard's friend needed a place to stay was indeed a time when something unbelievable happened. Not in a scandalous or dramatic way, but in a quietly transformative one. An unexpected guest brought an unexpected gift, the chance to forge a deep, meaningful, and entirely respectful friendship that awakened parts of me I hadn't realized were asleep. It taught me about the richness of human connection, the importance of empathy, and the continuous journey of self-discovery that life offers, even in its most familiar chapters. Our home went back to being just for the two of us. Our routines resumed. But something had shifted within me, for the better. I had learned that even in the comfortable landscape of a long-settled life, there is always room for growth, for new connections, and for the quiet, unexpected joys that make life truly rich. And that, I believe, is a story worth sharing.